Welcome to Mastering Your Financial Life, hosted by Judy Heft, the founder and CEO of Judy Heft and Associates, Financial and Lifestyle Concierge. This year, she's celebrating 27 years in business. In every episode, Judy interviews professionals who help others successfully manage their financial lives. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Judy is the author of 2 books, How to Be Smart, Successful, and Organized with Your Money for a Better Today and Tomorrow, and her latest book, Mastering Your Financial Life Cycles, How to Successfully Manage Money in Every Decade of Life. You can read chapters of her books and catch prior episodes of the show at www.judithheft.com. Now, here's the host of Mastering Your Financial Life, Judy Heft.
And welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. This is our 62nd episode of Mastering Our Financial Life. I'm Judy Heft, founder and CEO of Judy Heft and Associates, Financial and Lifestyle Concierge Services, helping high net worth individuals with bookkeeping and bill pay. And today, my esteemed guest is Eric Sarver. Eric is an employment lawyer focusing on the management side. He's the founder of Sarver Law Firm. And what they do is they represent, medium-sized companies, startups, business owners on business law, employment. They do contracts and anything that has to do with employment. So I'm really excited to be here with Eric today. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Judy. Great to be here on your show. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, a lot has changed in the last few years with COVID. I know for me, it was like that first week of COVID and my team was saying, I've called our IT people. We're going to figure it all out to work from home. I'm like, work from home? This is going to be a week or 2. Are you crazy? I'm going to eat my words after that. There we were a couple of years later. So, what has changed in the hybrid or the remote workforce? I mean, now, a lot of companies have switched to hybrid because people want to get back to the office, but then there's the other side that don't want to get back to the office. So what are some challenges on, financial impact and law on businesses with all this that's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question, Judy. And I had those similar words, thought it might be a few weeks, maybe a month or 2 tops. In hindsight, though, I'm glad we did not know how long the pandemic would drag on, right? Because it could have been perhaps too much of a shock for our systems. But to answer your question, a lot has changed. A lot of factors like to consider for employers as they go from the old-fashioned 4 to 5 days a week in the office to either fully remote or hybrid. So some factors to consider include what to do around internet and social media, right, monitoring. In the workplace, it's very easy to monitor people's, internet searches or their computers. Of course, you have to give notice in many states, including New York, if you do so. But what happens when employees working from home? Are you able and allowed to survey and have surveillance over what they look at during the day when they're on the clock, when they're off the clock? So that's one factor. We're also seeing factors around wage and hour issues come up. A lot of times, again, when people come in and clock out, an employer has a good idea of how many hours they're at the office working. But when people are working from home, especially if they're hourly employees, not salaried, so if they get paid time and a half for hours worked over 40, a lot of boundaries got blurred during COVID. So if you're sending your workers email questions or notices at 10 o'clock at night and saying, I need an answer ASAP, and that person works until midnight, well, that's 2 hours you have to clock in for them. So we're seeing issues around payment and wages, issues around surveillance of social media, and even what happens when you give people certain equipment, right? When do you get it back? What happens if they keep it? Can you subtract that from their last paycheck? And lastly, just we're seeing issues around, virtual workplace harassment is a real thing. And companies need to be aware of that what people do and say on Zoom meetings and in team meetings, the laws still apply around comments and suggestions and dress as they did when we were all sitting in a conference room on Madison and 42nd Street.
You know what? That's interesting, Eric, because I think we forget about that when we're on our computers. We don't realize that it's the same. Sometimes we forget that we're not we are in person with people because we're talking to them one-on-one or, in a group, in a conference. But on the other hand, we don't feel that same connection because we're not sitting there around the conference table. So it's I don't know, it's kind of a fine line there. People forget, I think, when you're just sitting at home, you have your pajama bottoms on and a nice shirt on top, and you're comfy and cozy, and you forget that you're working. Sometimes it could cause problems, I think.
Absolutely, Judith. Absolutely. And it kind of comes back to, one of the themes I know that we were talking about in terms of the show today that, right, you had some ideas into in terms of the financial impact, right? How could it be that a company is perhaps unaware of these issues or maybe doesn't handle them appropriately? And then what is the financial impact on the company? Whether it's through penalties and fines, whether it's through increased risk of lawsuits, whether you lose a lawsuit and pay damages, whether you win the lawsuit, but then you pay a lot of money in attorney's fees, right, to defend yourself. So, but certainly, I think you make a good point, Judy, that the fact that people forget they're at home, they're in a more relaxed environment. Maybe a young worker has 3 roommates in an apartment in Williamsburg, and perhaps they're very, kind of just going with the flow. They're not super formal. They forget to put on their formal persona they have when they're in the office, sitting at a desk with people around them, not in pajama bottoms, wearing a full, perhaps casual dress code, a business dress. So, but I think people do forget. I think you're right. And they need to remember. It's very important. They do.
It's interesting too. And that whole social media thing, I know, one of my employees follows our business on social media, and I see and I get notices when anybody clicks or likes or comments. And I know that she does some of that during the day when she's on working hours. But you know what, honestly, I don't really, it's just one person, it's one little thing. I don't go there with her, but I've thought about that. How do I know if my people are on social media when they're not really, I can't see them? It's all the honor system. We have to trust our employees, though, to do the right thing, right? That's the most important thing.
I think trusting is definitely one very solid, wise approach, like the one you just said, Judy. I have had clients, companies, business owners who have taken different approaches. Some, do monitoring. They have monitoring software that can monitor, say, the sites people visit from their home and they're at the office, and they have even ones that can monitor keystrokes. But again, you think about what might the impact be on employees if you're over monitoring, if you're hovering, if you're a helicopter employer, I'll say, instead of a helicopter parent, let's say, right? You might be actually having negative consequences you're incurring because you're disincentivizing, right, your employees. You're demoralizing them, right? They feel untrusted. They feel like they're not, you're saying they can't trust you to do your work. So if there's too much like hyper scrutiny of what they're doing every minute, most people will, regress and rebel, right? Just as if, they're a wayward, 15-year-old whose, parents are like, what are you doing today? So I think it's important to have that level of trust. And I would say that this is where good, solid performance plans come in, performance evaluations, job reviews. Because I've seen 2 different philosophies. Some companies say, as long as my employees get the work done and do it well and stick around, I'm happy. If they take a few extra breaks, that's fine. If they're on social media, that's their business. They get the work done. And others say, it all depends on to what extent, and if they're working for another company on the side while working from home. But how you approach your employees, though, you have short-term and long-term issues. So like maybe in the short term, you're solving the quote-unquote problem of people going to social media during their work hours. Maybe in the long term, you might be creating a problem of resentful employees who are not going to give their all. So it's definitely a tough balancing act. I will say that.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the first school of thought where, this particular one I mentioned is one of our top employees, and she does a great job and she gets her work done, goes above and beyond. And if something needs to be done, a little half hour after hour, she'll stay and finish it. So, you have to take the good with the bad. And when you have a good employee, you overlook some of those little things that really aren't a big deal after all. But if it was an employee that was constantly messing up, that's a different situation, because then you look at the whole picture and you see everything that's going on. So it's a fine line between being that kind of an employer. I think, I don't know. It's just sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error. You have to go with your gut once in a while. I know there are laws, but you have to figure out what works and what's right for you.
If I could add one more point to that, there's a lot of trial and error because the law sets a lot of floors of what people can and cannot do, right? The minimum amount, let's say, for example, pay, the minimum amount of, let's say, days off you're supposed to give. But then you put on your business hat, right? Your employee relations hat. And at least I do. And I say to my clients, look, what the law says you, the bare bones have to do, to not be in violation or have fines and penalties or suits is one thing. But if you want, like you're saying, Judy, if you want your employees to keep doing well, right, and and not to be resentful, and not to have employee morale sink, then perhaps it is important, to give them above and beyond, right, and to step back and say, maybe I'm not going to monitor them just because I can if I give written notice, And I think it's also about picking and choosing battles. I mean, in the remote workforce, if we had like an hour or 6 hours, I can go through all the things as, how do you advertise for internal positions? What about workers' compensation for your employees if they're working from home? If it's hybrid versus like a full remote situation, if they're coming to the office 4 days a week. So there are a lot of issues. I think we have to pick and choose our battles. And if your employees are getting the job done and not, jeopardizing the company's well-being, right, or using, let's say, company computers for sites that might cause viruses, if that's not the case, then I often tell my clients, look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just make sure you're following the laws around pay, around hiring, around sick pay and the like, and sick leave, and those kind of major points to keep in mind.
That's so helpful too, because Eric, for me in particular, I started out as a solo practitioner, a small business owner, and gradually over the last 27 years, I built this business to what it is today. Now I have 15 employees, and I kind of grew by the seat of my pants a little bit, and I had to learn about employment laws. I didn't know anything about that, and every state is different, which surprised me when I started hiring remote workers. And fortunately I work with an HR company and they guide me, and every time whenever I interview someone that's in a different state that we don't have anybody employed there, I reach out to them first and say, how are the laws in this state? How is that all going to work? Because California is a little crazy, and I'm not going to hire anybody from California because their laws are different. It's just too bad that there's nothing, national, that it's, consistent across all states, because it gets a little overwhelming.
It really does, Judy. A lot of my clients have this experience where, in the days before remote work, before COVID, if we're having this conversation in 2013, even 2015 or 2008, let's say, most companies hired local because of the commute factor. So, if you had a business like your own, let's say if you were in New York City, you weren't hiring people from Tennessee, Illinois, Montana, Arkansas, and California, because how would they get to work, right? A few industries were going remote or hybrid, but most were saying, we got to hire people in the tri-state area, and it's pretty clear to keep track of those laws. But you're right, there are different laws in different states, and that's why one thing I say to reduce the chance of making mistakes that can cost costly fines and penalties is to make sure you have an employment lawyer on hand who can update your employee handbooks. And of course, HR companies, if they're well-trained, can do a lot of this as well. But usually the employment lawyer gives their blessing, and also to say, all right, I have employees now in Oregon, Kentucky, right, Florida. What are the rules on maternity leave? What are the rules on salary transparency when I put out a position post? Can I have a non-compete? Is there a minimum salary threshold to say, hey, over in Minnesota, somebody making this much money and doing certain jobs is entitled to overtime. But over in, let's say, another state, it's a much higher threshold. They have to make a minimum salary to qualify to get overtime. So it's really important to know those laws. And as a business owner, I feel that, folks like yourself, you built a business, and that's fantastic. I too started as solo and gradually, got a small, humble but small staff in place of people. But what I find is it's you just can't keep track. And I mean, you couldn't run your business if you were constantly reading up on these laws every day. That's what I'm here for. That's what I do. That's what employment lawyers, HR professionals, that's our bread and butter is helping you to comply with the law. And then when you get into trouble, I do litigation defense. So if the company does go to court or the Department of Labor, they're being sued by an employee, I'm there to defend them, to the fullest extent.
It's always important to have professionals in any aspect of especially when you're running a business, but even as an individual too, because we are not lawyers, we're not doctors, we're not accountants. We don't know what's going on, and it's always best to talk to the professionals. So let's take a little break here, Eric, and then we'll come back, talk some more.
Sound
Hey there. I just want to tell you a little bit about my new book that just came out called Mastering Your Financial Life Cycles. And here it is. It's how to successfully manage your money in every decade of life. I co-authored this with my CFO, Liz Levy. And together we created this manual that's going to help you through every stage of life. We talk about having a baby. We talk about young adulthood, pre-retirement, what to do when you're at that age of retirement. If you're contemplating divorce, do you need an estate plan? We cover all of these, each subject in a different chapter. And I really think that you're going to find this so helpful because at the end of every chapter, we have checklists that you can look at and you can use, and they can be a guide for you. So this is a wonderful manual that we've created. It's available on Amazon. You can also find it on our website at judithheft.com/book. And we're here for you. If you need anything, reach out. I hope you enjoy the book. Here's another picture of it, just so you know what's going on. Here it is. And I'm really proud of it. It's my second book. And I'd love to have you read it and give me your feedback. Judy Heft, judithheft.com, financial and lifestyle concierge, celebrating 26 years in business. And over the years, I've learned so much. And what I've been trying to do is impart a little bit of this knowledge to you so I can help all of you become as financially organized as I am.
And we're back with Eric Sarver. So Eric, we talked a little bit about, the pandemic and how it affected us, but, like what are some takeaways, or lessons that we learned from the COVID-19 that we can really, that helped us to grow, I think, is that the question? Like, what do we need to know?
Yeah. It's a really good question, right? Judy, a lot of questions, a lot of takeaways, I think. One is that I think employers need to know and understand that their employees have a lot of them have had certain, they've had a chance to take inventory, take stock of their lives and their values and what's important to them. And many have come out in favor of work-life balance as a very important theme for them. So I think this is sort of like getting a little bit away from the employment labor laws. There's not a labor law that says you must provide work-life balance, but just as a business person who also gives employee relations advice to my clients, I'll say, look, right, listen to your employees and what their needs are. If they're looking, if they need a little time to do remote work, if possible. Obviously, if you're a restaurant hiring chefs, you can't have them working remotely, right, cooking food from their apartment or the house. But I think lessons include knowing to listen to employees, valuing employees. That's one, I think, big lesson that we've learned. I think another big lesson we've learned is that there are many issues that come up for employees around illness and disability, and accommodations are an important part of the law. Like the federal, state, and city laws regarding disability and religion do require that you provide reasonable accommodations to your employees, right? To basically to give them something that helps them to do their job, notwithstanding their disability. So we have seen after COVID, a lot of these claims increase because people realize that working from home in many industries, not all, but in many, is possible. So what used to be a reasonable accommodation request, the employer would say, no, you can't work from home. It's just not going to work. Too much technology, too confusing. Well, we've done it for 3 years, right? So I think that's another lesson to learn, that, look at your policies and see which ones you might need to reevaluate. And then perhaps maybe a third lesson is that, what I've seen is the Department of Labor in New York State, I'm going to say it, if they're watching, so be it, has gotten hungry for what seems like, replenishing their coffers. They lost a lot of money during the pandemic for a number of reasons. I can only use this as an explanation why they've been really coming down hard lately on companies and businesses for, everything from a wage issue, a prevailing wage, to late payments, to if there's a mistake, they're going to catch it and often come after businesses and be less willing to resolve it. So it's important. The takeaway is make sure that you as a company have professionals in place who can, number one, know what all the labor laws are around wages and payments and wage notification. And number two, that you have those people in place, such as myself, like my firm, that can implement those changes show you what needs to be papered and documented, what agreements need to be signed, what practices in place. And then number three, make sure that you keep very good records of your employees so that, if an employee brings a complaint to the EOC or the Department of Labor or court, you have a better chance of defending yourself. So those are three takeaways I can think of from the pandemic, really.
Those are great. Those are really helpful. I think that, like I said before, I was really against remote workers. I never wanted anybody remote. I like everybody in the office. I want to walk over to someone's desk and ask them a question, that type of thing. It's hard when you're bringing in new team members. Training is not as easy. But you know what? I've changed my mind 100%. I mean, it's just so much better now because we have these Zoom meetings with everybody and we try to bond that way. There's no water cooler anymore. So try to keep the culture and the fit going the way we want it. And so some good things have come out of that. And, with the growth of, talking to professionals like yourself and HR people, learning about, a lot of the different rules and laws that are out there and understanding that every state is different. There's so much that we needed to know. And, it's putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. So it's really helpful that you were here today, Eric. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. I know I did.
Thank you for having me, Judy. And yes, one of the challenges of being on any podcast discussing employment labor law is that, it's like sort of discussing a book review for War and Peace, right? It's a very dense topic. There are so many things we can talk about, but the basic takeaway is, just about right, employment, employer communication, documentation, knowing the laws in different states, knowing what's required. All the knowledge and all those practices can really help in a proactive way to avoid or reduce the risk of litigation and fines and penalties from the Department of Labor. So I'm glad I can be on the show today, Judy, and thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning into Mastering Your Financial Life, hosted by Judy Heft. You can read chapters of her books and catch prior episodes of the show at www.judithheft.com. Thank you for your positive comments and sharing this show with others.